let's start with they call it the joint session, right? The speech to the joint session, Donald Trump last night. It's basically State of Union.
Yes,
Some people saying it's more like a
yes.
campaign speech. What do you think? What are the things that stand out?
It was a campaign speech and it was a State of the Union speech, and it was both at the same time. It was actually, in some ways, a very interesting speech because it set out very clearly where Donald Trump's personal priorities are. And they were interesting. And again, with Donald Trump, you have to separate a lot of the language and the self-praise and the bragging and the boasting, which is, I mean, a lot of people find it very annoying, and perhaps in some respects it is annoying. But you have to look beyond that and actually look at uh, what was interesting for me was the weight, where the weight of the speech fell, and it fell overwhelmingly on domestic
Yeah,
issues.
yeah,
And you got a very clear conception of where it is, I think, that Donald Trump, his vision, if you like, of the kind of America he wants to create. I'm not saying it's an achievable vision at all, by the way, but anyway, he basically wants to return to an idealized picture of 19th century, late 19th century America, but with booming technology. he wants the
yeah.
technology, and he wants the social and structures and the economic structures of late 19th century American. He seems to have persuaded himself that this is the best and most optimal time in American history. But about foreign policy, he said very little.
Mhm.
And there were two things that really stood out for me. About China,
Yeah,
he said virtually nothing.
yeah. I
And
agree.
again, very interesting
Mhm.
very interesting contrast with Joe Biden. I mean, you remember Joe Biden
Mhm.
going into Congress, being very rude about China, being very rude about Xi Jinping. I mean, appallingly rude about Xi
Yeah.
Jinping. We got nothing like that from Trump yesterday, and that really is a refreshing change and a positive sign.
Mhm.
He didn't say anything about Iran either, I noticed, which is the other sort of bugbear country
Mhm.
for his supporters. But he didn't. I don't think he mentioned Iran. He mentioned the Middle East, but he
Mhm.
was very measured about foreign policy. He said a little about Ukraine and Russia, though not very much. Whereas it was
Mhm.
overwhelmingly focused on this wonderful world that America once had and which he wants to recreate. In his the way he presents it, it's a great vision for America's future. But I don't think many people notice that it's also very much a world of an idealized past, but an idealized past brought in some ways up to date. It's a strange mixture of romantic history and science fiction. Just if I can put it that way.
It's interesting because it is a long speech. They were saying that it's
Oh
probably the
God,
longest in modern history, one and a half, more than 1.5
yeah,
hour. So it's a long speech, but
yeah.
like you said, that there is very little mentioned in, foreign policy. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
one thing, I mean, one thing I have to say, wherever Trump appears, there's always drama, right? They removed
Yes.
one of the congressperson, right? The Al Green, who was rude, but he's not the only one. I mean, previously there were,
Yeah.
there's always somebody who will stand out and talk and loudly and very rude, but they were never removed. But he was removed, so that was kind of interesting. And then,
Oh,
oh,
absolutely. Always performances, always theatre with Trump. I mean, you remember there was the time in the first term when Nancy Pelosi ripped up,
mhm,
what was it,
yeah,
his speech behind him and things of that kind. Um, to my mind, it works to his advantage. All of this theatre ultimately projects the interest back on him, which is, of course, where you want it to be. It's strange that people don't understand that. But anyway, I interrupted you.
no, no, it's just the reaction from the Democrats is always interesting because they didn't
Mm,
applaud with Republican at all. Seems like even
mm,
with George W. Bush. who lied to the world about the WMD, get the United States into the war. Even with him, lots of times the Republican Democrats, the Democrats would, they would have stood up and applauded. But their hatred towards Trump, it just seems like nothing. We have seen nothing, this kind of a hatred towards Trump. It's stunning to me. I mean, I still kind of quite understand, but that's when I see it, it always reminds me that how much they hate Trump, right?
You're absolutely correct about this. You want to criticize Trump? Do so. There is a huge amount to criticize. I do so. We do so. Lots of things to say. I mean, I've just made criticisms of him. I've said that his image is a mixture of romantic and science fiction mixed up together. I mean, that's what I think of his speech. But hate him?
Yeah.
I mean, it is absolutely disastrous, and it's eating them up. It's making it impossible for them to oppose him effectively, because their emotions, their visceral feelings, are constantly getting in the way.
Yeah. Okay, the very little he talked about Mexico, China, Canada is about tariff, right? So the tariff he put in place started, I think, on Monday, which really scared the stock market. So the stock market has gone down for a couple of days, pretty significantly, mainly because of that. But I think the latest that the Commerce or the Treasurer was saying that they can meet these countries halfway. Somewhere I read that. So the reason I think the market reacted so strongly is that everybody thought he was just saying that, using this as a negotiation tactic. But now it turns out that he actually would go through with it. That scared the market, but he can continue to use it as a negotiation tactic. So do you think this will be it, or are they going to continue, maybe pull back a little bit with the tariffs?
Yeah, I think they probably will pull back, and I think we will have negotiations and all kinds of things done. But I think with Donald Trump, we have to accept one fundamental reality, which is that he has convinced himself that tariffs are a great thing and that this is the way forward for America. Whilst I was trying to get the text of Trump's latest speech, the internet threw up for me the speech he delivered to Congress in, I think it was March 2017. It was very interesting to compare the two, because he was already talking about tariffs then. He was quoting Lincoln about how important tariffs are. Of course, Lincoln lived in a completely different time, the 1860s and all this. But Trump is one of those people who gets a few ideas and they stick in his mind, and he just won't let them go. And he's persuaded himself that tariffs are, the magic cure for America's economic problems. And even if he negotiates and he gives here and he changes things there, ultimately he'll always come back to them, because, as I said, that's his solution. That's what he believes is going to transform America in the way that he wants to transform it. So yes, I think there is room for deals. But remember 30 days ago when he first slapped tariffs on Mexico and Canada, he then called them off after about a day, said, that they had 30 days in which to sort things out. The 30 days passed, and here we are. We're back with the tariffs. So he's always going to do this in the end. And I think we've got to be ready for this. And I think China, which has obviously got a very good interest in American tariff policy, needs to think and be prepared for that too. The other thing I would say about tariffs is that there's this big question of their ultimate legality, because tariffs are a revenue-raising measure, and there's a strong legal argument that you can't just impose them by executive order in the way that Trump is doing. You need authority from Congress to do it. Now, if you watch the scenes in Congress yesterday, one of the things that came across to me absolutely clearly is that the Republican Party are going to do whatever Trump wants them to do. I mean, they were standing up and cheering and applauding him. And for the moment, at least, he has complete control of his party. I think that at some level they're even scared of him. I mean, I suspect, that they worry that if he goes against them, individual senators or representatives, they stand little chance of getting re-elected. So at some point, there is a real possibility that these tariffs are going to be converted into law as a result of legislation, because the Republicans have majorities in both houses and they seem to support him on this. So again, I think that's something that China needs to think about, and not obviously just China, but every country. Germany ought to be thinking about it too, by the way. Not that they are, but that's another story.
Yeah, he also mentioned that April 3rd, he said it's going to be reciprocal tariff with other countries, which many believe he's referring to Europe. So Europe is next, I guess. So
Yeah.
Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting you're talking about tariff the legality. Some people believing that the whole idea for him to do it is to undermine the Congress because the Congress are in control of the tax revenue. Tariffs are separate. Some people interpret not necessarily that the Congress need to ratify some kind of a thing, but the Congress simply cannot control tariffs. So in that sense, if let's say he continued to raise tariffs and to the degree that that he can have a lot of money at his disposal, he even doesn't need Congress as much as because getting money from Congress through tax dollars, then he can even ask it for, tax cut for the people. There's some people thinking that was his intention. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting, and I'm aware of that argument, and I can understand. I can see where it's coming from. If you read the text of the U.S. Constitution, I can see how that case can be made. I am not myself persuaded by it, but I accept that is that case. Again, I think that I think that there is a lot of force to this argument that Trump had a lot of trouble with Congress in his first term, as all presidents do, but he did especially so because all those investigations were conducted against him. And if he can bypass Congress in any way he can, he will. And if he's persuaded himself that he can raise money to keep the government running without Congress, and he can do it through taxes, undoubtedly that is a strong incentive for him. But I come back to what I was saying. Even in, I think, March 2017, he was talking about tariffs. He was talking about tariffs even before he became president. So I don't think that is the whole reason or the only reason. And one of the reasons I say that people need to be wary of Trump getting Congress to enact laws about tariffs is that if you know anything about the American political system, if laws like that are passed, it's an absolute nightmare to get them repealed. You find it's particularly difficult because you get all kinds of special interests then start to benefit from the fact that they're tariffs. And these tariffs could then start to become permanent. It's not like it was with the Second World War and Bretton Woods and all of that, when doing away with tariffs was a popular and easy thing to do because it happened on the back of a victorious war, and at a time when the United States was indisputably the world's biggest economy. Today, the mood is very different, and if the Americans commit to this, position, to this course, it may be very, very difficult to get them to change their minds.
The other thing he mentioned is Zelensky's letter, right? That he's saying that he got a letter from Zelensky, and that is, of course, the whole drama. He's meeting with Zelensky. So, what is your takeaway from this whole drama? I got the feeling it's certainly, I don't think any of them just to pretend to play there's some rumors saying, okay, they just put up a show. I think the frustration from both sides is real. I think Trump probably, I got the feeling he's frustrated even before the meeting. I think his negotiation with Russia didn't go the way he wanted. didn't as smooth, as he planned. And then there was another thing, it's that the Britain signed a deal with the Ukraine on January 16th, which is 4 days before his inauguration. And that's also including some natural resource deals in there. It's not very detailed, but the deal, I mean, they mentioned that in the name of green energy, environmental protection, those sort of things. And so I think for him, he must feel like, okay, I'm going to be in power in 4 days and you sign such a big deal. So I think all these things, I feel like Trump is frustrated with the whole thing. What do you think?
He's absolutely frustrated, and his anger and frustration boiled over. He's furious with the British. I think people underestimate in London how angry with the British he actually is. I don't know whether you know, but there's a row at the moment in Britain because Vance made a speech in which he appeared to refer to Britain as this random country, no real significance. Vance denies that it was Britain, but if you look at his comments as a whole, it obviously was Britain. And I think Vance is reflecting Trump's feelings. I think Trump is very, very angry with Britain. I think he feels very betrayed by that treaty that Starmer made with Zelensky, which, as you rightly said, took the mineral rights. Bear in mind, we know that there are secret clauses to this treaty, and I'm sure that one of them covers mineral rights and probably does so quite a lot of detail. So, and Trump will know. I mean, Trump has all the intelligence. He knows what is written there. I mean, we can be sure he does. So he is furious about this. He's furious also that Starmer went completely against what Trump himself was saying, which is that Ukraine is on an irreversible course towards NATO. I mean, Trump is furious about that, which gets in the way of his attempts to do deals with the Russians. He's also, as you rightly say, finding the Russians far more formidable negotiators than he expected. And you remember, I've said this in program after program. You can't just go and meet the Russians and think that you can intimidate or bluff them or run rings around them. I mean, you can't. That isn't the way that you negotiate with the Russians. I've been in negotiations with Russians, not with the Russian government, but that was a pretty grueling experience. It's always a very productive one, a very educational, a very grueling experience. Everything that I've heard about negotiations with the Russian government is that it's conducted in that style, but on an even greater scale. I mean, you can't do that. But I think above all, his frustration boiled over with Zelensky himself, because he's come to realize that Zelensky's unreliable, that he is two-faced, that he offers to the Americans the same thing that he's already sold to the British, that he wants to lure the Americans into making military commitments to Ukraine, which the Americans don't want to give. I mean, that was what the row was all about in the Oval Office. And I think a contributory factor to all of that is that over the previous couple of days, both Macron and Starmer came to Washington, and they were clearly working Trump on Zelensky's behalf, trying to get Trump to make these military and security commitments. And of course, the Americans know all about that. They know exactly what is going on. But Trump, who I'm sure deep down was very, very angry about this, clearly went out of his way to keep cool. He pretended to be friends with them. But you could sense that he was seething. I mean, it came through briefly in his meeting with Starmer when he said, to Starmer, and can you take on the Russians by yourself? Everybody laughed. But I mean, people didn't realize that Trump saying that again is a flash of what he's really thinking about. Then Zelensky troops in. He tries to do exactly the same as Starmer and Macron. He does so in a much cruder, much ruder, and more arrogant fashion. he comes in dressed in this preposterous costume he's always wearing. And finally, I mean, it snapped. I mean, the Americans just lost their temper. Trump lost his temper. Vance lost his temper.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it built up to this. So I think you're absolutely right. What Trump wants to do is he wants to end the war in Ukraine, not principally because he cares about all of these people dying. He does, I'm sure, to some degree. I mean, give him justice. But we saw in his speech to Congress what his priorities are. He wants to focus on the United States. He wants to build up the United States. He wants to have his tariffs. He wants to have his new shining America that he wants. All of these things, Ukraine, the Middle East, Iran, they're all distractions. Even China, to some extent, is as important to him as it is for some people in his administration. And so he wants to just end this business in Ukraine. And what he's discovering is that everybody around him, the British, the French, the Germans, Europeans, the Ukrainians, even to some extent the Russians, aren't letting him. And as I said, that's why it boiled over.
Well, from Zelensky's perspective, my understanding is he needed some kind of security guarantee, which the U.S. doesn't really want to give. That's my feeling. And he's frustrated for that reason, I guess. Just an observation, from a negotiation viewpoint, this is clearly a very important meeting for him, a very important negotiation. I really think he should have an interpreter. I think interpreter would help several ways. One is, no matter how good his English is, the other side, that's their mother tongue. Okay, so he has a language disadvantage, and there's 3 of them versus him, 1. So having interpreter, I think, just to help in that sense. It slows things down when it's a very tense situation. It slows things down with interpreter. One more thing is, if he said something, first of all, he still have time to regret. He could even tell the interpreter, okay, skip my last sentence, don't translate that. And if something did get translated and didn't perceive well, he can always blame on the interpreter. You see, I was never a professional interpreter, but I did did translating in business negotiations, and that's being a professional interpreter. Everybody knows that you will get blamed sometimes, maybe unfairly, but that's part of the deal. That's part of the job. So I really think it's a mistake for him not to have an interpreter. What do you think?
You are so absolutely right about this. I am tearing out my hair that I didn't think of it and say it before, because you're absolutely right. I mean, I've been involved in negotiations, and when people speak each other's languages, it's always best to work through interpreters, certainly in high-level negotiations. In fact, the other great advantage of working through an interpreter is that precisely because it slows things down, it gives you time to think through your answer. You don't rush in and say things that you don't want to say. You're completely correct. It's, again, symptomatic of Zelensky's arrogance that he thinks he can just walk into a meeting and talk in a language which, as you correctly say, is not really his own, and of which he's only partly familiar with, and think that he can somehow prevail against native Americans, English speakers who physically outnumber him. I mean, that is, sometimes, Sophia, stating the obvious is so brilliant. I mean, you probably saw the light come on over my head, because you're absolutely right about this. I cannot understand how I didn't see it. And by the way, I haven't seen a single other person make that point, but I think it's absolutely correct. I don't think Zelensky will listen to that advice either. He's never uses interpreters when he talks to people in English, and well, we saw the result on Friday.
And remember last April, he had a phone call with Xi Jinping, and one detail is that China provided a Russian interpreter. I don't think China, because Zelensky's native tongue is Russian, right? So I don't think China's doing that to send any message or anything. I think China just understand how important to capture, exactly the essence of what he's trying to say. I think that's the reason. So just
You're completely correct. Can I just say something else? Because of course I remember we've had a discussion about that incident before. But one thing I hadn't realized and appreciated, and which casts that Chinese decision in a better light, in an even more interesting light, is that Zelensky's language, his native language is Russian.
Mhm.
He was brought up, he's a Russian speaker,
Yeah.
not a Ukrainian speaker.
Mhm.
Until 5 years ago, he didn't even speak Ukrainian.
Mhm.
And in fact, I've now spoken to several people who are Ukrainians, and they will tell me the same thing. He speaks Ukrainian very badly. So when you're in a high level discussion with the leader of China, you need
Mhm.
to speak clearly and
Yeah.
well in your own language, the language which you think in, which was Zelensky is Russian.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the Chinese probably knew that. I'm sure they did know that.
Mhm.
Of course, they would have known that. And it therefore made total sense for them to provide him with an interpreter who spoke his own
Yeah.
language,
Yeah.
which is Russian.
Yeah. And the diplomacy is so much nuance, right? So it is so important that people understand every word, right? Not misinterpreted in anything, out of any sentence. So Zelensky need to he need to have a better, I don't know, better advisors around him or something. But maybe, like you said, he might not listen. So okay.
Well, absolutely. Can I just say? I mean, my parents, my father, when he used to go to China, he did used to do cultural work in China, and he met with Chinese officials, and he met them. The guest house, the state guest house. We call it Diao Tai in
Mm-hmm.
English, but I'm sure.
Yeah.
But okay, so you know what I mean. But he met them there. So you see, these were high level meetings. The people he was working with, the Chinese officials, all spoke English.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
when the moment came for negotiations, they
Yeah.
always spoke Chinese and they were conducted through interpreters,
Yeah.
precisely for that reason.
Yeah.
And of course, he did speak good English,
Mm-hmm.
but he also spoke Greek, and there were their interpreters as well.
Mm-hmm.
So though they had a common language, they were very, very careful to speak in their own languages,
Yeah.
not in trying to do this with the other. And as you absolutely rightly said,
Yeah.
high
And the
level discussions, you should be very careful what you say.
yeah.
You need to be very, very precise and very careful.
And in Zelensky's case, because he understands English, it's actually put him into advantage because when they speak, he
Yeah,
understands. When he speak, they don't, right? So that
correct.
actually will work for his advantage. So
Absolutely. Absolutely correct.
the rare earth thing is a little bit puzzling to me. Okay, like you said, he already promised the British and then promised America. But there are reports saying that the U.S. Geological Survey doesn't find any, they don't have any records of the rare earth. So does Ukraine have rare earth or not? I'm not clear about this.
Well, I've been told by one of my Russian friends that the Soviet surveys that were done, remember, 80 years or 70 years was part of the Soviet Union. The Soviets are very, very good geologists. They didn't have any rare earths in Ukraine either. They don't exist. I mean, that's the other absurdity of this whole thing, that like a typical con man, he's selling what he doesn't have. People who sell the Eiffel Tower or Tower Bridge or something of that kind. This is what Zelensky's doing. So he sold something to the British. He's selling it again to the Americans. Except it doesn't. There isn't any reality to it.
Now, there's another saying that if there is any, they probably are in the East Ukraine where Russian took them. So
Yes.
Russian, and Russia has been talking about that also, that we
Yeah.
have. So is it so if, let's say, East Ukraine has the minerals or rare earth, what have you? Now the Russians saying, okay, let's develop them together. And if you do, you kind of recognize Russia is now in control. This is a Russian territory. Or from the Ukrainians' perspective is, yes, we have, but they are there, occupied by the Russians. So if you are going to develop with us, you need to get rid of the Russia. Is that how they're playing the game now?
Well, they are playing the game, but I think I should explain a little bit of context here, especially for your for our Chinese viewers, which is
Yeah.
that in fact, and I've been aware of it because I follow Russian news, but there was already scheduled long in advance a big meeting, one of these very big. The Russians love doing these big public meetings in Moscow, in which all the people from geologists and miners and all of these people come together, and Putin addresses them and they have a talk, and they're going to talk about rare earths and the importance of developing a industry to process rare earths and to do this in Russia, and it's all part of building up Russia's economy and Russia's development and that kind of thing. So this event happened. The Russians love doing this. Very different from the Chinese, but the Russians always have to talk about it in public before they launch a plan. So anyway, they did it, and of course, this all fell at precisely the same moment that the Americans and the Ukrainians were talking about rare earths. So the topic then got brought up, and it's not clear by whom, between the Americans and the Russians, because Trump apparently wanted the rare earths from Ukraine, and then he got onto the Russians and said, "Well, what about you? Do you have any rare earths?" Yeah, we got lots of them. and then it came up in this meeting in Riyadh, and the Americans then started floating this whole business about sanctions relief. So Putin's big investment chief, a man called Dmitriev, came along, and they had their meeting. But nobody in Moscow takes this seriously. Nobody in Moscow believes that there will ever be development of rare earths and all that technology in Russia, because the whole point for the Russians is to achieve technological sovereignty so that they develop all these things themselves. And besides, as many Russians have pointed out to me, rare earths aren't even rare. I think we talked about this in our last program. They're not even rare. There are plenty of them in the United States itself. The problem is not finding these things. It's refining them, mining them, and refining them. And that's what that meeting in Moscow ultimately was really all about.
And some people saying in China, some people saying that US trying to make it sounds like everybody has rare earths in order to kind of like show China, you see, you are banning this and banning that, but rare earth is, many countries have them, so it's not going to be effective. So it's a little bit of play like that. Maybe there is some elements of that, I wonder.
There might be. I mean, it's not impossible. And I mean, it is true. But then you get Trump when he meets with Zelensky over that course of that Oval Office meeting. He says, "Oh, you've got lots of rare earths," which they don't, by the way. The Ukrainians don't. We have them too, but we can't develop them because of all of these ecological people who prevent us doing that. You're kidding me. You really want me to believe that? Anyway, that's. I mean, you get all of this. I mean, my own view is that Trump went forward with this rare earths thing for three basic reasons. One, to make money for his friends. With Trump, there's always an element of that. Two, to screw the British, because of course they've done this deal with the Ukrainians. So so there's some element of that there as well. But thirdly, to see whether Zelensky would sign this thing, because he has convinced himself that this is a sign of good faith on Zelensky's part if he signs this deal, hands over to America all the rare earths he doesn't actually have, that this will be, an indication to the Americans that he's really serious about working with the Americans in order to achieve peace in Ukraine. So this is what I think is in Trump's mind. Not that Trump is always an easy man to read, just to say.
It's you're right, because actually, if you read the text about this memorandum or what have you, that he's supposed to sign but ended up not signing, there is one paragraph actually said, our agreement will not be affected by a third party which I think is referring to any European countries, and in particular maybe the
Too
British.
much to Britain. I mean, that's clearly what it's referring to. I mean, that is the. I mean, can I just say that agreement? I mean, you've been involved in commercial negotiations. I've had to draw up treaties. I've studied lots of treaties. I've studied treaties and agreements and contracts. That thing was how many was it, about 2 pages long?
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the most
farcical
documents. I mean, absolutely absurd documents I have ever seen. I mean, it was just basically a wish list. I mean, it didn't say where these things are supposed to be, how many they are. There's no capex. There's nothing. I mean, it's nothing. No price formulas. None of the things you would expect to see in a real commercial document of this kind. Even if it's only a memorandum of intentions or something of that kind. I mean, I haven't seen any of the Paris-Siberia documents that the Russians and the Chinese do with each other, but I have seen some of Gazprom's contracts, for example, that they made in Europe before, and I mean, even the original framework document we about that size, and then the other ones, I mean, well, they'd run into millions of pages. I mean, this thing is like nothing I've ever seen before. In China, they must be shaking their heads with astonishment when they see a thing like that.
So what's next? Because Trump said he received a letter from Zelensky. Seems like he's ready to sign. And he also said that the Russian is interested in peace. I mean, Russian always interested in peace. So are there any, I just don't see the middle ground if Russian insist on the 3 things that they wanted from the beginning. I don't see Ukrainian backing down on any of them.
No, right? I don't see they do, and I don't think. I mean, at the moment, I don't think we're any closer to peace at all. Actually, now about this letter, I've not read the letter itself, but Trump quoted from it in his speech to Congress, and the quotations were word for word identical to a post that Zelensky put up yesterday on his X account. And all I will say about that post is that it contains no apology, no sign of contrition. He's not suggesting in any way that he behaved inappropriately during that meeting on Friday, and the Americans were looking for that. And he says again that he's prepared to sign this agreement, but in the same paragraph as he says he's prepared to do that, he again basically says that he wants security guarantees, quite obviously from the United States. And I noticed that when Trump quoted that letter, he didn't refer to that section in which Zelensky talks about security guarantees. And then a few hours ago, as you probably heard, we got the reports that the Americans have now cut off intelligence information to Ukraine. And there's now reports in the British media, and I believe in the American media as well, that Trump is now telling the Ukrainians, look, it's not enough. Even if you're prepared to sign the deal now, it has to be renegotiated completely, and we've got to start from the first all over again. And it's got to be more tilted towards the US. And besides, we're not going to change our policy until we're really convinced that you're interested in peace. So it seems to me that all the Americans are doing is moving the goalposts, even as Zelensky tries to move a bit towards them and does so very half-heartedly. The Americans are just coming back and saying it's not enough.
Well, I mean, just very simple. To me, like Russia hasn't promised anything.
No.
Because Russia insisted on the 3 goals, right, from the beginning. And as long as Russian doesn't stop, I mean, I don't see how they can achieve anything with the Europeans or with America. I mean, I just don't see how it work.
Correct. Correct. I mean, the Russians are still advancing. They're catching more positions this morning. They're still winning. There's a report from Ukraine's deputy intelligence chief who says that the Russians expect to increase the size of their army by another 300,000 men this year. Their military industries are still whirring away. They're under no pressure now to negotiate and to make major concessions. So they're not going to. I mean, they're going to sit down and negotiate. I'm not saying that they're completely inflexible, and it's gone completely unnoticed. But the Russians also met with China and Brazil, the Friends of Peace group, China, Brazil, and South Africa, who have their own ideas about how to end the conflict in Ukraine. So I'm not saying they would be completely inflexible, but they're not going to make big concessions to the Americans, and they're not going to make big concessions to the Ukrainians either. And a point I've made many times, again, I think on these programs, and again, Chinese people probably understand this better than some Europeans and Americans do, which is Trump going on and on all the time about how peace should come as soon as possible, should come fast and all of that. What it communicates to the Russians is that he is anxious to make peace. He's anxious to make peace in Ukraine. And that gives the Russians leverage over him because he'll probably make concessions to them in order to achieve it.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like to me like Russia is because it's doing well in the battlefield. So Russia right now has the upper hand. Yeah. So
correct.
And Russia and China. So Shoigu visited China and met Xi Jinping. And last time we talked about Putin and Xi Jinping had the phone calls. So how do you interpret all this? What is going on there?
Right, I'm going to tell you what I think is going on. Now, obviously, this is my own personal opinion, but I'm pretty confident about it, again, knowing how the Russians work, which is that obviously the Russians are briefing China about the discussions with the Americans. And I think that from a Russian point of view is a Russian national interest. They need to keep the relations with China strong. But I think it actually goes beyond that. I think they're not only briefing the Chinese, but they're probably asking China, is there anything you want us to bring up in the negotiations? That is why Shoigu went to Beijing. If it was just, the Russians giving the Chinese a briefing, it could have been done over the phone. But Shoigu going to Beijing, meeting with Wang Yi and with Xi Jinping, is the Russians basically working out with the Chinese their negotiating strategy, working out, explaining to the Chinese what they think Russia needs to put forward, asking the Chinese, is this okay? Do you want us to modify this here? Do you want us to do this there? I think that is what the Russians are doing. And again, based on what I know of how the Russians work, that is exactly what they would do.
Well, but honestly, I don't know what can China do though. I mean, as long as Russia insists on those three goals, which Ukraine will not agree to. So what can China do? What can anybody do?
Right. Because it's clear that the Americans are pursuing bigger objectives than just settling the conflict with Ukraine. And the Americans have said, for example, that it seems, I mean, we know from the readout of the call between Putin and Trump that the Americans brought this up. I knew they would. I said it. I anticipated it would happen. That the Americans are asking the Russians to help mediate between themselves and Iran. So that's one thing they want to discuss. There are probably going to be all kinds of economic things. I had a source who gets me information about things that have been talked about within the Russian parliament. And the Americans are concerned, apparently, in the discussions about the overall status of the dollar and about whether BRICS is moving towards creating an alternative currency to the dollar. which it isn't, by the way.
Mhm.
But the Americans have even floated the possibility that they would like to be able to participate themselves in these new financial structures that the BRICS are creating. And of
Mhm.
course, China is absolutely central to all of that. So, in advance of negotiating about any of these questions, the Russians absolutely need to know what China's views are,
Mhm.
because something, and again, Chinese people need to perhaps understand this. For the Russians, the greatest mistake they made in their foreign policy, as they talk about themselves, was the quarrel with China
Mhm.
in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Because at that time, if you look at the origins of that quarrel, there were lots of reasons for it, but the key one was that China gained the impression, about which, by the way, it was absolutely right, that the Soviet Union was prioritizing relations with the West
Mhm.
over the
Mhm.
alliance with China.
Mhm.
So the Russians don't want that to happen ever again. They don't want to be put in a position again when they have an argument with China, the biggest country on their border. A Russian journalist on one of our programs on the Duran, Fyodor Lukyanov said that, for Russia, it is imperative that there be good relations with China. We
Mhm.
cannot afford to have again a quarrel with the biggest country
Mhm.
on our border. I mean, that would be insane. So they don't want to do anything that the Chinese are not already briefed about, and
Mhm.
about which the Chinese have not already expressed an opinion. So this is why Shoigu went to Beijing. And there'll be many other contacts and
Mhm.
communications, probably of a sort that we're not being informed about.
Mhm. And also the Europeans, they had a emergency, I guess, London summit after the Friday, the catastrophe meeting.
Mm.
What are they discussing, and what do they achieve in that meeting? Anything?
Well, nothing. I mean, you asked me about the Russians and the Chinese. It literally is, as we say in English, from the sublime to the ridiculous. I mean, they call this meeting together. They come up with exactly the same plan, European peacekeepers to Ukraine as part of a ceasefire deal, which the Russians have already rejected, backstopped by the Americans, which is something the Americans have already rejected. This is a classic example of doing the same thing again and again and again and again and expecting a different result.
Yeah.
So this is what the Europeans are up to. But of course, the Europeans are in a state of shock. And first of all, there is genuine grief across Europe that their beloved project Ukraine is not working. But of course, the other big fear the Europeans have is, and it's been there ever since the end of the Second World War, is that the Americans and the Russians will come to some kind of bilateral agreement with each other about the future of Europe, and the Europeans will be left out. They won't participate in those discussions. So the Europeans are desperate to get involved in those discussions, to basically to shape those discussions, or even if possible stop them. And that's why they're having all of these summits, and why they're embracing Zelensky, and why they're secretly, even if they don't quite openly say it, criticizing Trump. And they're trying to basically find a way back in to this negotiation.
Well, I find that the Europeans now, if you look at China, China so far now, other than being informed, and then China so far hasn't done anything, right? They just
No.
stay away from it. Can't the Europeans also stay away from it?
Well, it's a point that the Russians have made. So look, we're having discussions, we're having bilateral conversations with the Americans. That's our sovereign right. That's America's sovereign right.
Uh-huh.
Why do you think you're entitled
Mhm.
to a seat at the table?
Uh-huh.
Why can't two countries talk to each other?
Yeah.
Why do you think that you have to be there?
Mhm.
It's important to say that the Americans and the Russians are talking about lots of bilateral things, as we just discussed. And that's, as I said, why the Russians want to speak to the Chinese. They're not telling the Chinese, we want you to come into the discussions, but they are briefing the Chinese. At the same time, nobody, the Americans and the Russians, are not directly negotiating a peace settlement over Ukraine. Now, this is a misunderstanding a lot of people have. What is being discussed is setting up negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in order to work towards a peace, not the Americans and the Russians settling the conflict between them over the heads of everybody else. So why should the Russians and the Americans not talk to each other? Now, the Russians say, if you want to involve yourselves in discussions, it's very simple. You pick up the telephone and talk to us. You talk to the Americans all the time. Why don't you talk to us? Why didn't you send your own representatives here to Moscow? And absolutely, we will speak to them.
From the beginning, I think what's going on, what happened between Ukraine and Russia should be, I think the Europeans shouldn't get involved. Let them talk, let them, sort this out themselves. And that's basically what China says, between, the mainland and Taiwan, it is our matter. It is a domestic issue. Everybody should just leave us alone. There in China, there is a thing called rule by doing nothing. Okay, 无为而治, which means many times doing nothing is a strategy, right? The inaction, exertion itself is a strategy and could be a good strategy. You don't have to always do something. I find the Europeans always feel like they have to do something. They have to, in and out, jump up and down, and they have to be there somehow, do something. Okay, now they had a meeting. Okay, now we have a meeting. It's an emergency, but they achieve nothing, right?
Yeah, you are so correct. As a former lawyer, can I just tell you, that is the advice you mostly give your client. Your clients come along, they get very excited, they're very panicky. They say, look, so and so is doing X, Y, Z. We must meet, we must have meetings, we must take action, we must do this, we must do that. And nearly always, when I say nearly always, 90% of the time, and that's not an underestimate, your advice is don't do anything, don't say anything, just let whatever happens happen. And this cannot do you any harm, and in the end you put yourself in the better position. And that's exactly what the Chinese are doing. In fact, to the extent that the Chinese have said anything at all, they said, we're fine with this. I mean, go ahead. America, Russia, talk to each other. If you can find a way towards peace in Ukraine, that's wonderful. That's what we've been trying to do. So why should we complain? That is exactly correct. But of course, in Europe, with all these vainglorious people that there are there, that is impossible. They cannot leave alone. They can't sit back, let events take their course, wait and see, make their move at the right time. They just are unable to do that. Once upon a time, you had leaders in the West, and they would have understood the point you're making, but today's leaders can't. And of course, beyond that, there's also a deeper cultural problem, which is that not only is it difficult for the leaders to not do something, but their societies, and above all their media, expect them to do something all the time. I mean, this frenetic activity. I mean, there's always activity, and there's never purposeful action.
Yeah. The media is a big problem. I think. They always want something happen, right? They always ask those very provocative questions too. That's a big problem. Trump's talked about leaving NATO. Do you think he's serious?
Yes, but I don't think it's the thing that he is prioritizing at the present time, and I think he understands. I mean, it's important not to underestimate Trump's political skills. By the way, I think he understands that moving forward with that is premature. But I don't think he likes the Europeans. I mean, Why would he, given that they made it very obvious that they don't like him? Just saying.
Yeah.
But I don't think he likes the Europeans. I think he thinks that the Europeans are a bunch of socialist welfare scroungers, basically, who are always coming along whining to the Americans and wanting help from them. So I don't think he likes the Europeans very much. They obviously don't like him. He doesn't see why America should go out its way to help the Europeans. He's made it very clear that he doesn't believe that Europe faces any kind of threat from Russia. So I think it was left to him. He would move and leave NATO. But I think he realizes that it's not something you can do today or even tomorrow. Probably he feels that if the relationship with Russia is sorted out, it can be done quietly in its own good time.
Someone in the Chinese media commented saying that the Europeans actually had it very well, very good before the war. We talked about that the Europeans had a cheap energy from Russia, cheap labor, and then of course the Chinese market from China. But also their securities are, from the United States, protection. So the Europe got all the advantage from these three big countries. And now there seems like having problems with all of them.
Well, that is absolutely right. And I wish somebody would point this out, that Europe has managed to get itself into a situation where it has bad relations with all three of the great powers, and it won't accept that it has done anything wrong. It insists that it is right about everything. It acts as if all of the others are bad and wicked and have betrayed it and have done all sorts of bad things. They won't accept that, perhaps Europe could have handled its affairs in a different and better way. But there we are.
The other thing, the Epstein file has been released. It's a big disappointment, though, I have to say. It's redacted. What is going on? You think Trump is not sincere when he talk about he's going to release the JFK, RFK, MLK file? Are they going to be the same, like just redacted all over it?
Well, we'll just have to wait and see. I mean, one thing that makes me a bit hopeful with the JFK files is that obviously Robert Kennedy Jr. is a member of the Trump team,
cabinet,
the Trump cabinet, and we've never had really good conversations, but he knows me and I know him, and I know his views, and we have mutual friends, and I know that he takes this very, very seriously indeed, because it's his uncle and his father that we're talking about, and he absolutely believes that there was some kind of conspiracy. So I mean, he's in fact sure of that, and he will always be a voice within the Trump team to release everything. And I get the sense that we will gradually get more and more, but it will be a battle every inch of the way. And it's also perhaps important to remember that by now, a lot of the most important and critical documents will have been destroyed. I mean, it's a long time. I mean, people do destroy documents, and I know that happens, and bureaucracies do. So even if we get through the whole process, if every single document that is there is released and all the redactions are done away with, which I don't expect, by the way, still there will be lots of unanswered questions and still lots of gaps.
I mean, the Epstein one is really disappointing because they redacted the things that already widely available on the internet. So, and they were not talking about investigate his death. I think that's need to be investigated. He clearly didn't kill himself. So who's behind it? And,
well, you're telling me. Well, of course.
And then those tapes. He has a lot of tapes. So who are on those tapes? What are those tapes, right? They don't say anything. Yeah.
Mr. Epstein was a man of extraordinary mystery. I mean, no one has ever explained, first of all, how he became so rich.
Yeah.
It's a simple question. How he became as rich as he did, and when he became as rich as he did, because he was a sort of small-time Wall Street trader one day, and then a couple of years later, it looked like he was, a semi-billionaire. How did that happen?
Yeah.
When did that happen?
Can you explain to me what's going on in Greece? There have been lots of protests, pretty big ones. What is going on there? What are those protests about?
Yes, I mean, Greece, I mean, the proximate cause of the protests was that a year ago there was a big rail accident. Lots of people died, lots of damage was done. People were very upset and angry about it at the time. And there's a sense that it hasn't been investigated properly, that people who were responsible have not been held to account. So there is this is the immediate cause of this. But the underlying cause is that the situation in Greece is not actually good. I mean, if you read the European media, they talk to you about this rapidly going, recovering economy and all that. But that's not how it feels at all in Greece. In Greece, living standards have never recovered to anywhere close to the level that they reached before the 2008 financial crisis. The effect of austerity has been devastating. GDP is still below pre-2008 levels. There's a widespread sense that the government is very out of touch and that there's extreme levels of corruption. And people feel very exhausted and very angry. And this particular issue has caught fire amongst them. People feel that this is just this accident and the failure to investigate it properly and to hold people to account was just emblematic of a deeper illness within Greek society.
But there's a lot of protests in Britain as well, right? So Britain is also in economic turbulence as well, right?
Yes. Yes.
But don't you think the Europeans should get together talking about economy? You know, how can they revive the economy of the whole Europe continent?
Well, indeed, I actually made this point some days ago on one of my programs on my channel, which is during in fact the London summit, and I said, look, Keir Starmer has been to he went to the Paris summit, he's visited the United States, he's now had the summit on Sunday, he's spent the whole of last week on Ukraine.
Yeah.
When is he governing, actually running the country? When does he spend time running the country itself? And in fact, in the media, you hear that he spends more than half his time on foreign policy.
Oh, okay.
And this in the middle of a country that is indeed going through a recession, where again living standards are falling. My dentist, I went to my dentist this morning, and she announced to me that she's emigrating. She's even arranged to tell me the country she's going to. She's going to Romania because she finds life in Britain so unbearable. And this has happened to several people I know. So we have a very, very bad situation there. And our prime minister, and this is true right across Europe, is not focusing on our domestic problems. They're focusing on Ukraine, the threat from Russia, the betrayal by Donald Trump, all of these things, all very, very far removed from the real concerns of British people. There's a very angry article today in the Daily Telegraph by a journalist I don't like at all, by the way, called Alison Pearson. I mean, she's very, very right wing, and I disagree with her about pretty much everything. But she makes exactly this point. She says, in the place where I live, my friends are in great economic difficulty. Local businesses are closing down. People are losing their jobs. All of this, and instead, we have our prime minister talking about sending troops to Ukraine. This is not really attending to our problems. And it's people are saying this in France about Macron. They're going to start saying it very soon in Germany about Merz, who's come up with new ideas about doing away with debt breaks and things of that kind. But it's a problem right across Europe. And you're absolutely right. Surely the right thing to do is to look at the underlying problems in Europe and to start to address them. But if you do that, then you open your way up to all kinds of questions. People might then start asking, well, shouldn't you repair your relations with China? Shouldn't you move
Mhm.
forward with
Mhm.
all of the investments that China was offering and
Mhm.
trading again with China properly? Shouldn't you import Russian gas again?
Yeah.
Shouldn't you do all of those kind of things? And of course, that's what the leaders of Europe don't want to do.
Uh-huh. Okay, that's the problem. Okay. Because that will reflect their failure on their foreign policy,
Absolutely.
right? Okay.
Absolutely.
How do you feel about Oscar? I have to say I get less and less interest in Oscar. Once upon a time, Oscar is such a big deal. I would get
Yeah.
friends over, we will watch it together. This year, I don't even know the movie. I'm not even
Mm,
interested. Other than I guess the best documentary is a good one. No Other Land. I guess it's a good
yeah.
topic. But other than that, how do you feel about Oscar?
I'm absolutely bored by the whole thing. Bear in mind, my aunt was an actress who worked in
Mhm.
Hollywood, so I mean, I should be interested, but I'm not in any conceivable way. I mean, the other thing to say is, I mean, the American film industry, in terms of the uh, quality of the film it produces, is a shadow of the
Mm,
film industry that it once was, and it doesn't have the global sway that it once had either. I mean, once upon a time, you know, the films that America produced, everybody watched. Who watches them anymore? I mean,
yeah.
was it Gladiator 2 or Gladiator 3? It came and vanished without trace. I mean, hardly anyone was interested.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I guess I saw some comments saying, well, nobody interested in the Oscar when the egg price. It's true, the egg prices. Even Donald Trump admit that in his of Union. But of course, he blamed Biden for it. I don't know
Yeah.
what what exactly the problem, but our eggs are expensive.
Well, indeed, yes.
Sometimes it's gone. I can't even find them. That's
Well,
just
there
true.
you go. Yeah. Yeah.
So
We had the same problem in Britain some months ago too, by the way,
yeah.
that eggs were not to be found anywhere.
Hmm.
And my children eat lots of eggs, so for
Hmm.
us it was a problem. Just saying.
I eat a lot of eggs, most
Yeah,
families do. So
yeah.
I don't know exactly the problem. There was times that I couldn't find it, but of course later we saw them and then they got quite a bit more expensive. So that's
Mm.
yeah. Trump need to do something about the inflation. I have to say, if he's focusing on domestic, he has to work. I don't see how can that work with these high tariffs.
No,
But
nor can I. Nor can I.
so that is because you can see the price has gone up everywhere. It's
Yes,
true.
yes.
So
He
we'll see.
talked a lot about inflation in his State of the Union, his address to Congress.
Uh-huh.
But again, as you absolutely rightly say, he's taking measures which are almost designed to make it worse.
Hmm.
I've said this already, and I'm going to say it again. If he wants to bring inflation down quickly, what he needs to start doing is walking back all of those sanctions on Russian energy.
Hmm. Hmm.
if
Yeah.
if there's more Russian energy flowing more freely around the global energy system, oil prices will fall,
Hmm.
and that will take some of the pressure off inflation. Just saying.
Yeah. And all the tariffs and sanctions, I think all of them contributed to high
Well, they
prices.
do. Well, they
Yeah.
do. I mean, somebody told me recently that sanctions now affect something like 30% of world trade.
Hmm. Hmm.
And every sanction, you see, it has an accumulated cost. I mean, even if trade continues, people have to pay off each other, or they have to
Yeah.
take higher insurance, or
Uh-huh.
they have to work through middlemen, or everything becomes more complicated and therefore more expensive.
I just feel like if I were doing a trade, international trade, it must be complicated because they do also secondary sanctions, right? So, and there's so many countries are under sanction. How do you even keep up? You cannot work, doing business with Iran, with China, with Russia, with this and that. It must be a pure nightmare to do business now today.
It is. What can I just say? I mean, I'm Greek, so I mean, I
Yeah.
have some contacts with the shipping world. I can tell you that is exactly what the problem is. So, you have a ship, it's going to say take a cargo of flour
Mhm.
from from Karachi, say in Pakistan. But then you have to worry, is the company that you're dealing with, are they connected in some way? Are they maybe connected in some way with a Pakistani company that is dealing in oil trade in some ways with Iran, shipping oil from Iran to India or something of that kind, in which case you risk getting caught up in secondary sanctions. I mean, you have to think and worry about all of these things all the time. And it is an absolute nightmare. And you try and get protection from it. You try to get insurance cover from it. You try to talk with the authorities about it. And they themselves, as you absolutely rightly say, have no idea what's going on because it's impossible to. And it is an absolute nightmare. It goes on. It really has affected world trade in exactly the way that you said.
It's the United States now, I think, it break the rules-based international order, I think.
Well, it does. Well, it absolutely does, because the whole concept of the rules-based international order, as we always hear about, supposedly started with the trade rules that were set out in the World Trade Organization. This is where apparently the whole language about rules-based international order originated from. Who violates them most? The West does. As China repeatedly points out, there is no authority for imposing sanctions unilaterally anyway. And secondary sanctions, absolutely not. The only international body that has authority to impose sanctions is the Security Council, the UN Security Council, under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. No one else.
Yeah. But then then it's like chaotic everywhere just because US say so. Okay, so all right, we will see. I mean, it seems to me, I agree with you. I think Trump liked chaos. He liked to create a lot of chaos because he thinks he can control it and possibly even getting something done during the process. Whereas, okay, we will see.
You're absolutely correct. That's exactly what he thinks. But of course, there's that old. It's ultimately a Greek saying: "He who thinks he can ride the storm will reap the whirlwind." This is, you've got to be very, very careful if you play this. I mean, it's not a wise strategy at all.
Yeah, he's creating a lot of chaos. I mean, domestically too. I mean, I have a lot of issues with his, including the Doge, what they're doing. I like what they're doing with the USAID, but there are lots of other things they're doing. I don't know. It's very chaotic to me. So we will see.
Yes, agreed. Agreed.
Yeah, we can talk more next time.
Next
Thank you so much.
Okay, then. Have a great day. Get better. Get better.
Okay.
Have a very good week. Bye.
Bye.